administering web access. This is yet another one of the nuggets I think is going to be really short. And the reason for that is that with web access, you're really doing sort of a subset of what we can already do inside of our virtual infrastructure client. Now, the web console is, it's designed to be sort of a VIC Lite, if you will. And you're not always going to necessarily want to be using the web console, but there are some instances in which the web console can come in quite handy. If you don't have availability to the VIC, or if you're at a remote location, or if you just don't want to install the VIC wherever you're at, the web console will give you some limited functionality so that you can administer at least the virtual machines in your environment, so you can do so without having to have that full access. Now, we're going to talk in this nugget about what is the web console, and we've done that just a little bit, and also why we would want to use it. We're going to navigate through that web console, and then we're going to show how you can use the web console in one specific use case, and that's the idea of creating and sharing a remote console URL. But first we want to talk about essentially what is the web console. Now, the web console is a way for you to, via a web browser, like a Firefox browser or an Internet Explorer browser, to administer the virtual machines inside of your environment. Now, you're not going to get all the fancy functionality that you get from within the virtual infrastructure client, the VIC, but you do have the ability to add and remove resources to virtual machines, to start them up and power them down, and to navigate within them inside of the virtual machine console, so you can manipulate your virtual machines. Now, why would you want to use it instead of the virtual infrastructure client? The biggest reason is not really you as the systems administrator. The biggest need is not for you to be able to do this, except in those rare instances when you need to very quickly do something on a virtual machine and you don't have your VIC console lying around. Where it comes in handy specifically is whenever you're providing access to other people in your environment. Now, if you think back to our previous note where we talked about user permissions, we talked about this idea of delegating out user permissions. And we brought up this little picture here that talked about the various levels at which we can delegate out user permissions for our virtual infrastructure. And now we also talked about when you're creating these resource groups for your HR group or your development group or even the IT group, that you can provide them with either access to the virtual infrastructure client, the VIC, or you can provide them access to the web console. Now, when you have users that you don't want to expose the full functionality of the VIC, you can expose to them just the very limited functionality of the web console. And so what they will get is, if they only need to manage virtual machines, if they only need to power them on, power them off, and add and subtract resources, then they don't have to deal with wading through all of the other configuration screens that they're going to see inside of the VIC. So it makes it a little easier for people if you don't want to deluge them with all of the features and functionality of the VIC. Now, this is really why the web console was invented in the first place, is so that you can provide for those lesser users a lesser user experience for them to make it a little easier on them. Now, we're going to take some time and also navigate that web console, and then also show how to create those remote console URLs, because if you want to even go a step further and provide even less access to that remote console, to that remote virtual machine, you can do so by creating and sharing what's called a remote console URL. So let me go ahead and minimize this down, and we're going to take a look at our Internet Explorer here. Now, in order to connect to the web console, we have to go through a secured HTTP connection, so it's HTTPS, and you can either use the IP address, or you can use or if you have it listed in your DNS, you can list the DNS host name. I'm going to do 192.168.0.106. This is the IP address of the virtual center server. This is not an individual ESX host. So 0.106/UI. If you go to /UI, that will take you directly into the web console. But before I do that, actually, I want to go back to a location that we've been to before. Now, if I go ahead and just go to the root of the host name here, obviously I'm going to get an error message here because this is a self-signed root. There's a self-signed certificate. You can add certificates later if you want, but for the most part, since you don't really need to verify the validity of where you're going, the self-signed certificate is good enough for encryption alone. So I'm going to continue to the website, even though Internet Explorer is complaining about it. And you'll see here we get a certificate error associated with it because this certificate cannot be traced up. It's not trusted all the way through. If you choose to trust this certificate, you can choose to click the Install Certificate button here and actually install and trust this certificate inside of your certificate certificate stored, then you won't get those error messages later on. I'm going to click cancel out of here. If you want to trust that certificate, you're welcome to. So this is really the root of our web access into our virtual center here. You'll see VMware Virtual Center 2, welcome. And from here, we have a couple of different options. Now, very, very early on inside of this series, we talked about going to this location to get the virtual infrastructure client. This is the VMware infrastructure client here. If you download and install it, then you can do with what we've been doing up to this point. But what you can also do here is choose this login to web access. If I choose to log into web access, I get another screen that appears that asks me to type in my credentials. Now, you'll notice here it says browser not supported. The Internet Explorer 7, this particular version of virtual infrastructure does not support IE 7, but it does enough that we can actually show what you need to see. The other thing you'll see here is that pop-up blocker is detected, and if you intend to use items specifically connecting client devices, you're going to need to disable that pop-up blocker because there's a pop-up that appears as part of the connecting of client devices. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say always allow pop-ups from this site, just like we would anyway with any site that we wanted to disable the pop-up blocker for. You'll see here that the JavaScript's trying to close the tab now. What we're going to do now is type in our credentials. In this case, it's our Windows Active Directory credentials to log on because we're logging on to the Virtual Center server. If we attempted to log in directly to the ESX server, we would type in our Unix credentials. So here I'm going to type in administrator, and I'm going to put in my password, and we log on. You'll see here the /UI is populated, and now you can see we have access to our VMware Web Access console. The first thing you'll notice is really how simple the console is. There's really not that much to it. I've got my virtual machines I can play here. If I double-click Nugget Data Center, I'll see all of the list of virtual machines that are configured in that Nugget Data Center. I don't see any of that DRS and HA, and I don't see performance, and I don't see a lot of the stuff that you're used to seeing inside of the VIC because this is really, really trimmed down. Up here under Web Access, I can choose the Help menu, or I can log out. I can expand or collapse sidebars and tabs, and then I have some limited things that I can do with those virtual machines. If I click on a particular virtual machine, this is Nugget 1, the virtual machine that we've looked at before, it's a nice tidy interface in that we can see what the status is of our virtual machine, and arguably this interface is almost a little bit tighter than the VIC interface for seeing this information. We can see if there's been any recent alarms. There haven't been any recent tasks, of which there haven't been also. We can roll up and roll down our menus here for performance and memory and for hardware if we want to make more room available for ourselves on our list here. This is all the information that we're pulling again inside of the VIC. If we click on events here, we can see the events that have been associated with this machine. It's loading the events right now just like it would inside of our virtual infrastructure server. Let me click down here under Nugget 2 so you can take a look at some of these events here. You'll see when the event was triggered, well, who it was triggered by, the type. We can see what the message was associated with that event. We can also see some details down here about the specific details of this event, what was triggered and what the message was, and all the related events associated with that event. We can also see alarms if we want. Are there any alarms associated with this virtual machine? It seems like Nugget 2 doesn't appear to have any alarms. Looks like Nugget 1 doesn't have any alarms. Also tasks, if there may be some tasks that have been completed on that virtual machine. What are the tasks? Administrator did a complete power on to the virtual machine, and the virtual machine is started. Here again, related events. And then also the console. Now you'll see here that the first thing that we see whenever we want to run the console is that there needs to be an ActiveX control that needs to be installed on our workstation for us to be able to use the web console to control the console of our virtual machines. You'll see here down it says VMware Remote MKS Active Control not running. Now you're going to need to deploy this to any people, or at least provide administrative rights, or help them install it on their machine if you have non-administrative users that are going to need to be able to use this tool. So if you again use the principle of least privilege in your environment, and you don't provide administrative access to people in your environment, but you do need them to have access to the VMware web console, make sure that you do provide either the installation file or push it to their workstation or get it installed on their machines so that you can run the console. Up here at the top in our alert bar, you see it's already attempting to run the following add-on. If I click down here and run the ActiveX control, it will allow me to install that ActiveX control to actually do that management. So once the ActiveX control is installed, we should get access in here to be able to view our console. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you're outside of your environment, or if you're connecting in through VPN and you don't have, full connectivity into the environment, very limited connectivity, web only, by doing it in this way, it makes it very easy for you to manage your machines from an outside network. You may have an outside network, an outside environment that only has port 80, port 443 access in. By installing this now, we can get full access into our console, into our virtual machines to manipulate them across a very thin interface. It only requires one TCP port 443 access to do that manipulation. In the same vein, though, if you provide that external access into your consoles, be aware that you secure it properly so that someone can't be out in the big bad internet somewhere and come into your website and be able to really administer, to get inside of your data center, and administer all the machines inside of your data center. So we're not going to really play too much with the console here because you've seen it before, you know what it looks like inside the virtual machines. But really, in order to get that console to work, you do have to have that ActiveX control installed and functioning on the machine. Now, if we do have machines that are powered off, just like here with Nugget 2, we can do some things like adding in new hardware or powering on the system, etc., etc. You'll see down here, if I click on the commands, I have a few commands that are available to me. I can power on the machine, I can add hardware, etc. I'm going to click the Add Hardware button, and you'll see that there are different types of hardware that we can add. All of these are very much the same as the types of hardware that we added inside of the virtual infrastructure client. We can choose a hard disk here, create a new virtual disk, for example, do the capacity and location. All of this will link directly into the information that's inside of my virtual infrastructure server. Now, what's important to know, though, is that the access that you provide to someone via VMware Web Access is going to be limited by what you provide for them inside of users and user permissions. So when you decide to deploy, however you decide to deploy out this access into people that are quasi-administrators or non-administrators in your environment, make sure that you go very granular with what sorts of permissions that you can add into VMware Web Access or add to the person so that they have just the right things that they need inside of VMware Web Access. Now, there's one thing that I really want to show you because it's probably the niftiest part of this. And we talked about how VMware Web Access was sort of the light version of the VIC. Well, there's another tool that's actually sort of a light version of the VIC, or even a light version of VMware Web Access. And that is the concept of generating a remote console URL. Now you'll see here, right within this view, the person that is manipulating this machine still has the ability to add and subtract hardware and see events and alarms and tasks and those sorts of things. But what if you want to reduce down the amount of stuff that they can see so it's even a less amount of stuff? This link here called Generate Remote Console URL will take you to a new screen that allows you to do some neat things associated with how you connect in the user into the remote console. You'll see here that you can use this form to generate a URL that provides direct access to the console using any email application or web browser. I can say if I want to limit the view to the remote console, or do I want to hide the details such as event logs. Let's say I want to just show the remote console and nothing else. I can also limit the view to a single virtual machine so that the user is not aware of what other virtual machines are inside of the inventory. So you can click these to limit down how much information you're going to provide to that user. Now, once you've done that, though, we'll click down here. You see that the generated URL is this long string of essentially a password, if you will, that says who has access to log in. Now, obviously, the person that receives this password needs to be able to kind of keep this under their hat. If they send this out to somebody else, they send it to anybody, they're going to have access to get into the console if they have the right permissions. But essentially, you can copy and paste this URL into an email message or an internet browser and use that to have the person get into the virtual machine. If I take what I've just copied and show myself as an example here, I can go, okay, here, and we go paste in, and now we're pasting ourselves in. And you'll see now that the web access provides me just access to just what I need specifically, just the console. And then I'm going to close this down because we're not really interested in waiting for this to pop up, because it does take a little bit for it to pop up. But just be aware that you have that ability to get in to view the virtual machines. Now, there's one more element that I want to show you that you can see whenever you're inside of the web console here. If we hit close here, and then we'll actually log out of web access. What I want to do here is return back to that first screen that we looked at, right, whenever we were first starting this nugget. Because if you're a developer, if you're the type of person that actually might do some sort of development inside of your environment, and you want to create your own scripts and things associated with VMware and VMware infrastructure, there is an SDK available that you can use to create some scripts, to create some applications that may help you better administer your environment. Here you can download the SDK, which links you to vmware.com/support/developer, which includes all the documentation, the sample code. It includes the VIC scripting environment and the COM scripting environment and your JavaScript environment and all that stuff. But what's really interesting here is your ability to browse objects managed by Virtual Center. Now, this is a really, really neat tool here, because what it allows us to do is see all of the properties and all of the methods that we could potentially connect to in order to manipulate our environment. Let me go ahead and type in my password here. And you'll see here that here is an object browser, if you will, that discusses what properties are in my environment and what methods can I use to do something in my environment. Let's say I want to see what my capabilities are. I can click and see capabilities for type and multi-host supported. If I want to see what kind of content is on my environment, I can see what's in my content, event managers, license manager information, performance manager information, and see what those performance information data is. Again, these are just the properties that are available for me. This may not necessarily be the data associated with those properties, but what are those properties? I have methods here also that I can take a look at. If I want to manipulate, change something about my environment, see, I can retrieve service content here, and I can invoke a method that provides some information back for me about what is in my virtual infrastructure environment. Again, all of this information is designed for the developer who's going to take this and write some sort of managed code application or even some sort of script to pull data out and then use methods to manipulate data inside of the environment. But this browser is a really nice tool, because finding these objects can sometimes be painful if you don't have the ability to kind of browse around and look for the objects that you're looking for necessarily. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We talked about web access and what is the web console and how you can use it. And we talked about how, although it's a good thing for you as the administrator to be able to use it, one of the best uses of the web console is to give another individual sort of a limited access view into the servers that they need. We talked about how you need to install an ActiveX control in order for them to be able to view the console, and how that control has to be installed first before they can actually view that console. And then we talked about navigating the web console and how to move around it and how to create and share those remote console URLs by copying and pasting that big long URL out of the box and putting it into an email and sending it off to our other users. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.